quick introduction to set the scene for myself. I run the Science Ceilidh. We support creativity, culture, wellbeing and equity across Scotland and beyond, and support things like the Ideas Fund, supporting communities to engage with researchers and not the other way around. It's cultural democracy, and I'm also a consultant and work with the NCCPE as an associate trainer. If you're watching at the moment, I'd love to hear who you are actually, and we are streaming live on YouTube. If you'd like, you could tell us who you are, which institution you're part of, what you're excited by, what you've enjoyed over the conference. And of course, you can also watch this back and the recording as well. So even if you're watching this in the future, as it were, please feel free to say hello, ask questions, and certainly if we get the questions live, we're going to bring them into our panelists. Our first speaker, who's going to share a bit of a case study, is Emily Crompton, who's going to talk a wee bit about the conversations in the Library of Engagements, and she is based at the Manchester Metropolitan University. Emily, are you there?
Hi, yeah, I am. Hello.
Fantastic. I'm really looking forward to hearing you speak. I'm going to stop my camera and you can take it away.
Thanks very much. Thanks so much, Lewis. It's really nice to be here and to talk about my project. So yeah, I'm showcasing an ongoing research project, which is called the Library of Engagements. The project itself has developed from my master's dissertation project. So I'm an architect. I teach and I research at Manchester School of Architecture. And I also learned there 10 years ago, kind of a long time ago, but my dissertation kind of research was all about engagement methods, looking at methods that are employed inside and outside the built environment. So 10 years later, having had lots of experience in practice and in community and action-based research, the library itself has developed into a teaching tool, an installation, a research resource, as well as a call to action. So in itself, the library is a tool for participation, as I single-handedly try and enthuse the world to do more of this kind of stuff. And in simple terms, it's a collection, it's an archive of methods. I'm interested in the tools, in the techniques, the paraphernalia that goes along with this participation stuff. And in looking at that, I'm trying to identify what it is about those particular methods that enable or disable engagement, particularly in design, in the built environment especially. So the piece of work that I'm showing in the exhibition is a podcast called Conversations in the Library of Engagements. And it was a piece that was conceived as a way of getting to some of the more undocumented impacts of the engagement in built projects. The conversation focuses on the transformation of the individuals involved in those projects, more than in the conclusion of a particular engagement activity or the designed outcome. It is more interested in how those people developed those relationships, how those methods helped them, and how it impacted upon their own kind of view of the built project. So the podcast itself looks at two community engaged projects, one in Liverpool, in Anfield, called Home Baked, and one in Manchester, the Manchester LGBT Centre, which has just kind of been completed. So it's hopefully I'm hoping that you might enjoy listening to it. It's quite long, but you can kind of flip through. There's some things, and I've also got a file from the archive of pieces and documents from those two projects, which connect to those two projects. So you can imagine you're sitting in the Library of Engagements. So I hope that was okay as a bit of a starting point to introduce you to my project.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Emily. And whilst I've got you here, I mean, it'd be really good to just pick up a question, perhaps, if that's all right. If you could give one piece of advice for others, I mean, I'm a massive fan of a library. What single piece of advice might you have to think about? What would you share on?
So I think it's interesting that it kind of came from, like, I was generally collecting loads of ways of doing things. I think we all individually have that. We kind of, oh, that's a really good technique, I need to remember to use that. Or like, even if it's just like an icebreaker, like, oh, I've never done that before, and then you go and do it in another place. And I think the thing that I find with any engagement activity, and when I teach it especially, I always try and remind people that it needs to be designed. It is a piece of design in itself. You know, you're designing a way of talking or a way of making a decision, or a way of just, you know, communicating to someone about a certain thing. So I think the critical thing is sort of knowing your audience, knowing that context, and making sure you're talking at the same level, because sometimes, especially with architects, they can kind of talk here and everyone else is like, what? So I think that's a big part of kind of the tools and the techniques that I try to share as part of it. But from the conversation itself as well, I think the biggest thing that I don't know, almost like if I knew it from the start, I think it's such a difficult thing doing that kind of work and doing participation for building projects, especially because they're so large and complex and they involve so many people. That I think it's just to have patience. You have to have patience with any kind of group. So I think that's the biggest thing that I learned really as well.
Patience, listening, human-centric design, all the great stuff. Amazing. Thank you so much, Emily, for that. Take care. We're going to move to our next case study at the moment, and please do feel free to keep asking questions as we go along. This is Head, Hands, Heart and Feet, and it is case studies around equity, diversity and inclusion. And our first speaker on this is Natalie Walls. Natalie, are you there?
Hello, I am.
Brilliant. Lovely to have you here, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Lewis. So as I said, I'm going to be doing the Heads, Hands, Hearts, Feet approach, which is a nice way for me to personally reflect on this project, which is called Letterbox Science. And it connects digitally excluded audiences with work done in our research institute using postcards featuring microscopy images and simple texts written by our scientists and beautiful illustrations as well done by artists. So the institute is fundamental biology, so things to do with DNA, cells, mitochondria, really small and sometimes quite abstract things for the public. So what it has taught me, so this is to do with my head, is that doing things through the medium of physical mail is actually logistically quite difficult. And it requires quite a lot of thought. And luckily we had expertise in our admin team to navigate the Royal Mail system. So if anyone is thinking of using sort of snail mail to do anything, it does require a little bit of expertise, which I maybe underestimated before I started. And what I've learned to do differently is in the few pilots that we've run, I've learned not to assume that we know what the public will find interesting about our work. Working in fundamental biology is often perceived as challenging because there isn't always an obvious application, as would be the case in environmental biology or perhaps robotics or something like that. However, in the conversations we've had, it seems that people are much more interested in simply understanding how their bodies work than myself and my team had anticipated. I expected that they would want to discuss the big, quite ethical questions, like perhaps designer babies and genetic profiling and things like that. But people also seem very interested in just having an informal discussion about the mechanics of how cells and DNA work in our bodies. So yeah, going forward, I'll be more conscious of assuming that I know what people want to know from our researchers. How has this work made you feel? So this project has made me feel very hopeful for the place of science and science communication in our society going forward. We get a lot of responses from a lot of different demographics that are typically underserved by public engagement for reasons of socioeconomic background or just willingness to engage perhaps in an online space. And it seems like during the last 2 years that the news sometimes was perpetuating the idea that society was disinterested and even distrusting in science, particularly in certain demographics. But the responses that we got from people was quite the opposite. They read as people who were inspired and hopeful about the possibilities that science and research offer for them in the future. And that was very humbling and validating for me, and more importantly, for the researchers who were leading on the project as well. And what will you do now or in the future as a consequence of the work? So going forward, I'll be wary of being too prescribed in my idea of how a project should run. And one of the most impactful pilots we're currently running as part of Letterbox Science is a collaboration with the Cambridgeshire Older Persons Enterprise, and it's part of their Talking Together programme, which is basically 6 facilitated 45-minute sessions with 6 to 8 older people on the phone chatting about a given concept. They've run these focusing on history, art, storytelling, Cambridge lore, but never science. So we decided that we would run one focusing on some of the concepts explored in the postcard artwork that they're sent ahead of time. When we designed the project originally, we did hope to reach older people as they are quite often digitally excluded, but we'd never considered this as a way to do so until it was suggested by the COPE team at our first meeting. And at first, this seemed like a step away from the original concept for the project, but it's been an insightful way to use the resources that we developed to reach a very specific audience that are often underserved, and particularly now that so much has moved onto the digital platform. So it actually fits the aims and the objectives perfectly of the project, despite being not quite what we had originally planned, but it still uses the resources and very much reaches the people that we're aiming for. And had we decided at the start that that was out with what we'd envisaged, then we would have missed out on so much learning and really valuable working relationships with great local organisations that we now work with very closely. So that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the Talking Together and the Letterbox Science Project, but hopefully that's a good basis for more questions during the panel discussion as well.
Thank you so much for that, Natalie. Before you head off, again, I want to steal you for a question, and I guess, obviously a lot of it moved on, and really take that point around, not being too prescribed and not assuming, and I think that's a really key theme. How did the pandemic and the lockdown in particular affect, some of the working with older people, some of the audiences? Would that be okay to ask you?
Of course, yeah. So when I joined the Institute just over a year ago now, it was a seed fund project, basically, that was just a tiny little nugget of an idea from one of our scientists. And it was basically born of the pandemic and how, so much was going online, and these particular researchers were just taking a little bit of time to consider those people who maybe couldn't do that or didn't want to do that and didn't want to be on the online space, and particularly people of low socio-economic backgrounds that maybe have one laptop between the whole family, trying to homeschool, trying to work, that maybe just need a different way to engage and feel connected in some way, and older people who traditionally maybe don't as often want to engage that way. So it was almost a pandemic born concept, and we use that very much as the basis of how to engage. But yeah, as the pandemic sort of ramped up and it got even harder to connect with people, we found the trickiest thing was people that are facilitating these conversations with older people being so busy with really important, on the frontline stuff, that they didn't necessarily always have the time to have these extra conversations. But the people that we did were really, really insightful and provided a lot of context for the conversations that we were having and what these people were maybe doing out with those 45 minutes that we're chatting with them. So it's been a real eye-opener for an audience that, in my career in public engagement, I've maybe not engaged with quite as much. So it's been really great.
Fantastic, Natalie. Yeah, there's some really interesting themes there around, I know, for example, digital exclusion is a big thing, of course, and and as you say, but what I really like about that approach is that also, yes, it is about bringing more people online, but actually some people want to engage in person and like really miss that. And actually, I think it's something about 10% of people who aren't online because of digital connectivity is through choice. It's not because they don't have access, it's because they don't want to be online. And I think there's something about how we don't miss that element as well. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Natalie, for sharing that. That's really fascinating. And we'll speak to you a little bit later.
Thank you.
Cheers. All right. Well, that brings us really nicely to our discussion, particularly around inclusive online engagement and what that actually means to us within public engagement, to the different people that we'll bring on. So a little bit like magic, they're going to pop up on screen as I introduce them. We first have Annie Rigby and Andrea Henderson from Newcastle University, who are doing a project called Multiverse Lab, and we'll hear a wee bit more about that very shortly. We also have Jessica Sells from Guy's and St Thomas's NHS Foundation Trust. Fantastic. Hello, Jessica. And then Lucinda Spokes from the University of Cambridge. Fantastic. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. We've already made a great start with thinking about digital exclusion, thinking about all these different things, thinking about inclusive practice. So the first thing I'm going to ask, and we'll probably just go in the order that I've just introduced you, just for the ease, is if you'd be happy to introduce yourselves and tell us maybe a kind of a summary sentence about the project. And I know Andrea and Annie, you're working together, but maybe your element or your side of the project would be great. Annie, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, thank you very much, Lewis. My name's Annie Rigby. I'm from Unfolding Theatre, and we delivered a project called Multiverse Lab with Newcastle University and a range of health research and social care research partners. And the ambition of Multiverse Lab was really to enable people who are often underrepresented in the public engagement that shapes health research and social care research priorities, to help those people who are often underrepresented to make their voices heard. So at the heart of it was was the same question asked to many, many people, which was what is the health research or social care research breakthrough you hope to see in your lifetime?
Beautiful. I was desperately trying to make a note of the key question. That's a really important one. Andrea.
Thanks, Lewis. My name's Andrea Henderson. So I'm head of engagement at Newcastle University, and we were one of the partners involved in the Multiverse Lab. And I think for me, it's particularly with this panel is the project itself moved between a physical and an online presence, and how that kind of blended approach has resulted in some fantastic engagement and some really interesting stories that hopefully will feed into our research around social and health care.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Andrea. We'll head over to Jessica then and tell us a wee bit more about your project.
Hi everyone. So I'm Jess Sells. I'm the Patient and Public Engagement Manager at the Research and Development Department of the Guy's and St Thomas's NHS Foundation Trust. And the project I'm involved in is the King's Health Partners Summer School, which invites 15 to 16-year-old students from underserved backgrounds in Southwark, Lambeth and Lewisham to come and take part in a week of interactive activities with the aim of giving them experience of what it's like to work in clinical research and to encourage widening participation in STEM subjects. And so I think my predecessors had done it before me. I think it was in person for 6 years, and for the last 2 has been online. So I recorded a podcast to kind of showcase the pros and cons and challenges and the learnings from moving it from an in-person to an online space.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Jess. And we're definitely going to pick some of those learnings apart, and I can't wait to listen to the whole podcast, but yeah, we'll draw some of that out in this conversation. And that finally brings us to Lucinda.
Hi, hello. So I'm Lucy Spokes. I'm Head of Public Engagement at Cambridge. And our conversation we've been having, and hopefully lots more conversation as part of Engage, is around who we're choosing to exclude. So we ran our online Cambridge Festival this year and really brought home how very clearly that whatever we do, whether we engage online or in person, that we're making choices about who we exclude. So we started with a major focus when we were planning on digital exclusion and how we would overcome some of that, not all of it, of course, but some of that through activities we had with City Council, physical activity packs, lots of things. But the evaluation actually showed how accessible online engagement was to both our international audiences, they're a new audience for us, but also really our very local audiences. And we want to continue this discussion about how we can work to include the accessibility of all of our things to everybody, whichever format they engage in.
Wonderful. I really want to pick up on that, Lucinda, and I was going to start back with you before you mute again, because I guess what I really like about that is that intentionality around picking that audience and being really specific about what we mean, and because different platforms work for different groups, and actually there's always going to be an element where you'll have to be very open to listening, and something that might work for some disabled people, for example, might not work for others. So again, there's that kind of, I really like how you frame that about who we're choosing to exclude, because it is a decision and not an easy one necessarily, because again, you're balancing lots of things. So I guess maybe the converse of that question then, from that research, from the work that you were doing, who were you engaging? And I suppose who, through the means that you're trying to do, who could you kind of expand the wider circle to? So I don't know if that makes sense, but
yeah, I think we've got too many questions actually at the moment, and we certainly don't know the answers to many of them. And actually, just doing this has really changed how we think about when we engage in these large-scale public engagement projects. From the feedback, we were showing that we got an international audience, and that's just about reach. It was brilliant. We reached people across the whole wide world. But I think what was really challenging for us was about our local audiences. About the accessibility from a disability perspective, but also around caring responsibilities. Really different feel about being able to access things if you've got children, if you've got caring responsibilities, if you've got work commitments. And it really changed how we're programming the next event. Two, we haven't solved anything, and the trouble, I think, is we want to do it all, but there's also the thing about capacity and about how small teams working on large projects, how you do the best that you can, but also protect the well-being of your staff as well, because that. But I think it's about how we work in partnership with our people within our communities, how we work with those key people that we engage with ready, so that we can find ways of effectively reaching as many people as possible. But I think hybrid working will be the way we go for forever now. We've all learned so much. And then there's lots more discussion about reach and significance, and this it's a whole different new form of public engagement. And we really want to have this discussion with people across not just the public engagement sector, but also other sectors too, because there's such brilliant practices happened during this period.
You've already hit on the H word, hybrids. I'm sure we're going to get there, and absolutely. And so we'll park that, because I want to ask the same question around who are you engaging, and just talking a little bit about that, because I know, Annie, for example, you're talking about, again, that intentionality. But yeah, I think just to pick up on what you were saying, even actually deciding times of things, that's a really good example of like, okay, so even this lunchtime, okay, for some people that's great because they want to listen to something, but for others that isn't good because they want a proper break, and it might be considered work. So and that's not and obviously this is recorded, so there is a best of both in terms of how you approach that. But even thinking about, is it 2:00, is it 3:00, what about caring responsibilities, but then if you do after work, is that also, it really is a very difficult thing. And then, as you say, there is no perfect time for anybody, so how do you manage that? So perhaps let's go to Annie and maybe Andrea, or if one of you wants to answer, just in terms of who are you seeking to engage, and then we'll go to Jess, and then maybe we'll start picking up a little bit on this hybrid approach as well.
Yeah, so we weren't looking for one target group. There are many target groups that are underrepresented in making their voices heard in all kinds of public engagement, I'm sure, but particularly that the health researchers and social care researchers had identified, they knew they were hearing less from Black and Asian and ethnically diverse communities. They knew they were hearing less from both extremes of the age spectrum, so young people and older people, the LGBTQ plus community. There were kind of a list of people in working class areas, from kind of socially, economically more challenging areas. So that absolutely what's been talked about a hybrid approach is very much our learning. And I think we developed Multiverse Lab as an online experience and as a digital tool out of necessity. It wasn't planned to be that way originally. It was planned to be something that toured communities and festivals, but the pandemic hit and we delivered it online. And what's been really exciting about that blended approach is it means that we have been able to bring it to different communities in different ways. And I think just because you've developed a website that's got some snazzy software, that's the beginning, really. It's then, well, how do we use that? And we had a lot of success in, for example, doing Zoom socials, because quite a lot of people were kind of intrigued, but wouldn't necessarily have the impetus to go independently on an individual web experience and record their voice or put in their text input. But bringing them together in a kind of social setting, whether that was on Zoom, whether we did that, when we went out and visited communities and used the kind of software out and about on high streets and in community settings. Because also I think the other really interesting thing about engaging underserved communities in questions around public engagement is quite often they're not expecting to be asked and they don't really have an answer ready. So we also found the power of hosting really important, making sure we had a really diverse group of hosts, including a BSL speaker, including an Urdu speaker, including people that represented those different demographics we were trying to reach. To bring different communities together and to connect, but also quite often we'd ask the question and people would be like, oh, I don't know, and then, say, oh, well, have you any experiences about health or about social care, and then instantly everybody's got a huge wealth of experiences in their family and in their friends. And so suddenly we unlocked so many kind of rich conversations, but you needed that kind of personal contact or impetus to unlock quite a lot of that for a lot of people. And I know from the university's point of view, it's quite a different way of collecting some of that, some of that data. But I don't know, Andrea, if there was anything you wanted to add from your point of view.
Well, really, I would just sort of echo about having people see themselves in the project. So when we moved online and having the hosts from completely different backgrounds, I think that was hugely helpful, rather than just, and I guess sort of the kind of campaign and the promotion of that went alongside, it didn't just rely on people maybe stumbling across a website and, look at it, you were drawn into it. And I think from our point of view, from the university point, I think that was a really, obviously working with a theatre company, a really creative way to get people to tell their stories. And like Annie said, sometimes people think they don't have a view, but then they're made to feel they're part of it, and they're much more comfortable to share their personal sort of lived experience. And I think, yeah, it was great.
Thanks, Annie and Andrea. Sometimes I go through a thought experiment and just thinking about something that I'm not, like a whole sector of society or kind of hobbies that I'm not that interested in. And then I think about what would happen if someone just said, all right, Lewis, what do you think in 5 years should happen in the Premier League? And I'm like, okay, I've not, so I think there's something there around, how how do you welcome in those spaces? And actually there probably is a relevance to my life in terms of, but you like doing sport, you like being outdoors, you can build up to that almost, but it's almost like that when we're in the bubble, you don't realize that how, after, at least even the framing, people are thinking about it, but that framing, you see it a lot in arts and culture actually as well. It's like, what's your people of culture rather than, I'm not creative. But actually, of course everyone is, but it's the framing and the invite, the seeing yourself in it is so important. Jess, to bring yourself in for that same question or any reflections.
Sure. Yeah. So we were targeting 15 and 16-year-olds, school students, and we were able to reach them through school contacts and doing a lot of communication with teachers and schools that kind of fit that the bill of the underserved populations, and going from in person to online. In terms of recruitment, it was a lot harder because teachers were really, really busy. Having to deal with so much more tasks. So there was an application process for the students to apply in. And from that point, we were able to communicate with parents who had less, restrictions due to the pandemic and online teaching and things like that. And kind of reflections of being online. It's both more inclusive and less inclusive from various perspectives. Geographically, we were able to extend it out broader to people who wouldn't have been able to come in person to do the event, or those that couldn't really leave the house for long periods of time if they have caring duties, things like that. It was also able to cater for various difficulties that students were experiencing. So there was one student from an Orthodox Jewish school, and the school didn't want her to attend in person. But it was impossible for her to attend if she could come in with the camera off. So that meant that we were able to kind of reach communities that weren't able to, come in person, as well as having a student that had said she had severe anxiety and would never have been able to come in person, and she was in the comfort of her own home. But yeah, again, in terms of excluding people that don't have that tech, when working with the schools, we ask teachers, who doesn't? Does anybody need us to lend anything for them to be able to come in and become involved? But because we were working with the school and they were already doing a lot of online stuff, they were already catering to and supporting those students that didn't necessarily have access at home. So yeah, that's kind of a little overview there of us reaching our audiences.
Yeah, I think that capacity question is always a big one, because the answer that very often is about partnership, but very often the people on the ground are absolutely they're delivering so much, and as you say, it's just like you don't want to be that extra thing, even though of course you feel like it might be valuable, but at the same time it's and certainly what we find in some of our programs, it's not even about money, so when we're working in rural spaces or communities, there isn't anyone else to buy out time for. Do you know what I mean? There is literally, they are the person and the individuals in that full capacity. So I think that's a really challenging dynamic to bring in there in terms of how then we do, bring in people who otherwise, without that kind of mediaship or that kind of partnership, would find it very difficult to connect in with. There's a couple of comments that I want to bring in from the YouTube channel, and I think then what we might talk a little bit about just for a few minutes is maybe, who are we still excluding, perhaps just a little bit on that, and then I think then we'll circle back to hybrid approaches and how we can hopefully bring kind of almost the best of both moving forward, because hybrid's been talked about a lot. I don't know necessarily if we fully understand what that actually means in terms of actually delivery and the capacity required for that, because it's certainly not just, it's probably not even just double the work. So the comments online, so the choice of platform, either in person or online, is just one element that affects people's ability to attend or not. Right alongside content, the time, the duration, whether it's free or not. And another element is whether it's exclusion or people's choice is also really difficult to pull apart. And I think that's a really fair comment as well, in terms of, again, we were talking about the that 10% element of people who have actively chosen not to or prefer not to be online. So yeah, again, how do you tease that apart from, other factors? So maybe thinking of those, that kind of theme, who are we, what communities are being underserved at the moment in terms of the work that you're doing? Maybe applying a bit of a critical thought to that, and any ideas of what we can maybe do next. Perhaps, I don't know, Jess, if you want to potentially start, that'd be all right.
Sure. I guess in terms of being in a hospital and patients led situation, certain conditions are more prevalent among certain communities, and there might be less trusting or more trusting of scientists and science. And I think that that needs to be broken down, and people need to be engaged with more to kind of build up that trust. And I think through community elders and community leaders, it's really important to make those relationships to be able to reach those specific communities and find out what are the best ways that we can engage and increase those people that are maybe excluding themselves, but also we are excluding because they maybe haven't stepped forward for it.
Now, we're coming slowly to the close of our conversation. We've got about 7 minutes left, and instead of my closing comments, what I'm going to suggest, actually, just as we move to the forward almost, well, what next in terms of hybrid, in terms of how universities are going to work more in terms of online engagement, for example. I'm going to re-invite back both Emily and Natalie. I'm kind of breaking script a little bit, but I think it would be nice to have a bit of a final panel discussion. So Natalie and there we go, pop. And Emily, fantastic. Okay, so what I'm going to suggest is that this is a kind of a last opportunity to share any reflections, and I guess thinking about taking what the discussion and what you've learned in your projects, what next in terms of hybrid? Is it hybrid? Is it more online engagement? Is it less? And how do we embed it within the institutions that we work in? In terms of order, I might suggest I might bring our guests in first, if that's okay. So Emily and then Natalie. We'll go Lucinda, Jess, Andrea, and then Annie to finish. Emily.
Hi, it's been really interesting hearing about your project and kind of how you are trying to reach different audiences. I think it's been a really interesting discussion, so thank you very much. And it's just great to hear kind of other people's experiences of doing it. I think one thing that I took from when I was talking to people who'd been involved who weren't necessarily the designers of those projects is how much ownership they had of that as a project, and they were so embedded in it. And for me as a designer in that process, I was very conscious to be affected by the comments that they were saying. And I wonder, and I guess maybe that's a reaction, like Annie was saying about how people are like, oh, well, where's it going to go? But what's the point of me saying it if it's not going to impact on someone and then action will be taken? And so I always wonder in these kind of public engagement scenarios, especially with ones that have large teams, it's always difficult to give those really emotional kind of stories unless you're there in the moment. And I guess, I always kind of think you need to give yourself the time to be there with that person and kind of to hear it, and then you can't then not be impacted upon it. You can't really ignore it because you're there. I don't know if the rest of your teams feel similar, or there's a certain type of person that kind of gets involved in this engagement stuff, but I wonder how that's been kind of trying to translate it to your colleagues, I guess.
And interesting, yeah. And if anyone wants to respond to that, that's fine. And people who are listening, it'll be interesting. I'm sure we can share some of those comments back to Emily. We'll go to Natalie for a kind of closing remarks. What next?
Yeah, that was really interesting to hear about everyone else's projects. But I just wanted to pick up on what Annie said about when you're asking for people's opinion on things, for them to not feel like they're just, talking into a void. Because one of the postcards that we send to these diverse
recording in progress
is basically to what they want from biologists, what they want them to be looking at or trying to develop, or what is concerning them and that sort of thing. So it is a very much almost a public consultation through this sort of medium of postcards and phone chats and things like that. And because we work in fundamental biology, it is really difficult to show that that's going to have an effect, because, if someone says something, it's not maybe automatically going to directly affect how we do our research, but it could, reframe how the researchers think about their research and how they view it in society, which is abstract, particularly if we're talking to, for example, year 5 primary school students. It's hard for them to understand the impact that has. So the researchers involved are really great, and they're taking loads of time to write back very personal letters to the school groups that we work with and the older people that we work with, and really say that what they've said has been passed on. We're sharing it within the institute, we're chatting about it over coffee, and let them know that is framing the discussions, and hopefully they feel like they're having an input into that scientific realm, rather than just we're going in and asking them questions about very abstract things and then not really doing anything with it. So I think it requires, like you said, Annie, a lot of thought and how to communicate that with them. And there is that hybrid thing, and whether online makes it more difficult or easier, I'm not entirely sure. I think it's very case by case, but it's exciting to see how we can blend these things together and get a really good working practice that maybe we wouldn't have considered 2 years ago. So being a little bit more creative about it is very exciting.
Thanks, Leslie. And that's all about partnerships and recognizing the different skill sets. I mean, the importance of tech support and all that type of stuff, that is, I think that's going to be fundamental. So thanks, Natalie. We're coming into our last couple of minutes, so I'll, maybe more kind of just last 30, 40 seconds of reflections. We'll go with Lucinda.
So I think hybrid is going to be something that we do for ever now. I loved the way that we've used interactive tools through events, things just like Slido, asking people questions. We've got many more questions, many more comments coming through this way. Hands up, I hate hands up. Only people who know the answer to the question, who have an opinion, will ask that one. So I love, and we're going to try that in a live space as well. There will be tutting though, I am sure, from people. So text, not touch, that's what we're going to use. But I think it's a very, I think we need to keep assessing that we're not just chasing reach with online, but we're trying to find ways to make things much more significant.
Oh God, with that, you've dropped the bombshell of evaluation and evaluating online, but we do not have time for that, fortunately, perhaps, because that is a golden chalice, I think. But thank you, Lucinda. Jess?
Just as a quick kind of closing statement in relation to the hybrid topic, and again, I have no idea how that's going to take place, but I think the key kind of take home message with that, or from my experience, is make sure you plan it with your audience and what is going to make them feel supported to do a hybrid setting, and how it will work for them to be able to let it become a good process.
Thanks, Jess. Absolutely. Co-production through all things, and that I think can be included. Andrea?
I'll probably just add to Jessica's point to say that, we've had a huge amount of learning, as we've all heard in the discussions today, and we've discussed over the last sort of 18 months or so. There's been a massive amount of learning. I think we've all come together as more of a community of sort of public engagement professionals and learning from each other and making our own mistakes and finding out new practices, but also that we don't sort of treat it with it's the new shiny thing, that it's one of the tools in our toolbox and we can use it alongside all of those different things we've been doing. And as long as we keep at the heart of that, the mutual beneficial collaborative approach that we would do in our space anyway. But yeah, I think it's pushed us to learn fantastic things, but it's given us another string to our bow rather than. So I think hybrid is brilliant, but we shouldn't lose sight of all the other things we've developed over the last couple of decades.
All right, thanks, Andrea. And then Annie.
I think what's been really interesting for me and for us is it's been a huge opportunity to experiment. I'm a theatre maker. I'm not somebody who set out, I'm not a technologist. And one of the digital team that we worked with to develop Multiverse Lab said something about, he was saying, yeah, but you are kind of a digital artist, a digital maker, because you've done this. And I think for me, it's been quite a useful confidence boost, I suppose. We worked in a new way out of necessity, and I think a lot of us have been exploring new territory and have done a huge amount of learning. But I think breaking down that sense of digital or online is other, and it's not my area of expertise. As Andrea says, these are all tools and we're all capable of using them, sometimes with more help than others, but so there's that sense of kind of confidence in new skills. But I also think this whole experience has been a really interesting opportunity to reflect on what are we as Unfolding Theatre really good at. And I think it's been about storytelling. I really think about that in the partner meetings when I talk about the data and the conversations we've had. I'm really aware that one of the things we can do is listen to stories and reflect them back in a way that impacts on people. So I think that's really exciting about partnership working as well, in terms of who those partners are, and a bit more kind of some unexpected combinations in terms of science, arts, technology, all kinds of different combinations of people coming together can be something really special.
That's a nice answer to round off. Music's my ears, certainly, with Science Kelly, certainly. Thank you so much. I mean, I've heard so much around intentionality, around hybrid, about being really considered about the approach. I think there's something that always strikes me about, you imagine this way of working 2 years ago. And for me, especially around equity, inclusion, diversity, that type of thing, it shows that when there's a real need, we can make changes very quickly. Very, very quickly. And I think that is something that we have to hold on to with whatever happens next. But thank you so much to all our speakers, Annie, Andrea, Jess, Lucinda, Natalie, and Emily. I think we'll end it here. Thank you for those who are watching. Sorry if we didn't get to your questions or your comments, but we'll have a wee look at the YouTube, and enjoy the rest of the conference. I think we'll give a cheery bye. Ta-da.